The Africa Free Trade Agreement, it's been signed, but it's certainly far from sealed. But there are regions across this continent where free trade agreements on a small scale are working. What are those and how do we learn from them? Dianna Games?
Well, I mentioned East Africa earlier. I think that, the size, the fact these countries are heavily interlinked. There's been a lot of investments in ports, now in rail, and actually linking the countries with infrastructure. So I think that in a way that also speaks to we've got to make this work. There's got to be viable, so we have to trade. And so I think that has pushed free trade. And in Southern Africa to some degree as well, I would argue.
We've got one of the fastest growing populations on the planet. The African continent projected to get to 1 billion people within a very short period of time. If we're not cooperating, if we're not collaborating, if we're not creating and manufacturing and then trading with one another, it becomes a very, very difficult place to live and work over the next 50 years, surely.
Well, let's hope in 50 years we certainly see a lot. I think you will see growth because you're seeing new leadership coming in. In fact, in this past sort of year or so, seen a lot of new leadership, and I think a lot of it will hinge on the kind of policies that are put in place and how seriously people actually take it. In terms of if we bringing down tariffs, let's make sure that non-tariff barriers don't spring up in their place. Let's make sure the value chain is creating value right through the chain in local economies across borders. It's really sort of a trade 101, but I think we have to make it work and stop layering more and more sort of bigger visions on top of smaller visions, and with none of them really working properly on the ground level.
You talk about new leadership, and South Africa certainly is feeling the groundswell of optimism with its new leadership. And we had Nigerian markets reacting in a rather downbeat way this week to the announcement from President Muhammadu Buhari announcing his intention to go for his party's nomination for the 2019 presidential elections in Nigeria. It's a sign of confidence that markets have in leadership, one of Africa's major economies. I mean, here is a situation where you've got a guy who was absent with leave for much of the first part of his term, very, very sick in hospital, then governing for a while from his bedroom, and now saying, I'd like another chance at leadership. You talk about new optimism and new leadership. This doesn't fit, as Africa's biggest economy, into that space, surely.
Well, Nigeria is one of the countries that didn't sign the free trade area. It's a heavily protectionist economy, and that is because it has actually left its industrial development so late, and the government itself is not supporting that development enough. They're simply putting in place the bans and the restrictions and saying get on with it. But in the meantime, there's no power. There's very little that's working to any kind of degree. So I think the fact that he's there for another couple of years, people think, well, this is a country where the median age is sort of 18 or 19. You have got a 75-year-old leader who actually is not in the best of health and who's been very slow to get that economy moving. He's had enormous advantage. He came in such a tide of goodwill, and then he fiddled around really for a year or so, really slow to implement a cabinet and economic policy. And he's kind of come to life again in the last year or so. They're trying to improve the business climate, to re-energize a lot of the infrastructure projects, and to generally sort of engage better with private sector and so on. But that's a year before the elections. Is what happens? And I think I think the disappointment is not the fact that party might stand again or run again, but it is the fact that there is so much need for new blood in Nigeria. There is just a history of recycled people, recycled old leaders, and Buhari himself has, by all accounts, not in step with the modern age, with the what Africa needs, what the way the world is moving, and he's relying heavily on his vice president to do that. But people want the leadership right at the top. This is Africa; it's very sort of top down, and I think I think there is a general disappointment, even among people who support the party that he stands for.
And here we got Nigeria, biggest economy on the continent, as a big exporter of oil, without its own refineries and without the ancillary industries, making it incredibly vulnerable to vacillations in the oil price. We saw at $120 oil, Nigeria was flying. At $50 oil, the wheels came off. At $70 oil, they seem to be doing a little bit better, and we're seeing signs of growth coming through. But those vulnerabilities are there. As South Africa, we're often seen as the bully boys of the African continent. We go in, we demand our own way. Is there a leadership opportunity for South Africa when it comes to free trade agreements to get a workable solution in place?
I think there certainly is. I think South Africa's already played quite a leading role in with regard to trade. But there is this view of South Africa sort of always having some kind of agenda to lead Africa. And the fact is that we are the biggest exporter of processed manufactured goods in Africa, or we certainly want to be one of the top three. And people like South African goods, but there's still kind of a resistance to South Africa taking charge of things, because there is this underlying view of it being neo-colonialist, especially when it comes to anything to do with business. So I think that might undermine. I'm hoping that, Cyril Ramaphosa he's new, is fresh in the job. He seems to be a charming person. I just think that we have a real chance of maybe addressing that kind of perception of South Africa as trying to be exceptional, trying to be, in charge, trying to a box above its weight in Africa, trying to lead other African countries that haven't given it that mandate, etc.
But what could we do, for example, with Namibia, with Botswana, with Zimbabwe, with Mozambique trade, Swaziland and Lesotho, for example, to create that microcosm of optimism, dealing with our immediate neighbours and spreading that influence through the continent, perhaps?
Well, I think DTI is now, through Trade Invest Africa, trying to look at a way of not so much giving back, it would be for South Africa's benefit, but of basically building markets, and it would be for South African goods, and building supply chains in neighbouring countries in order to benefit everyone, to lift all boats. I think, that seems to be a new kind of wave of thinking in our trade ministry. So if they can get that right, but I think that would go a long way. But I think a lot of the time South Africa is doing a lot of things, but it's not known. We seem to hide our light very much under a bushel for fear of being criticised for all these various things, rightly or wrongly. And so I think we could do a lot more about helping industrial policy at a regional level, even if we just keep it to this part of the world. There's a lot of pressure to say South Africa and Nigeria must work more closely together and so on. I don't think that's absolutely necessary. I think we've each got our own region to take care of. And of course, there are ways we can work together, but is that the priority? Maybe not at the moment,
Dianna Games, thank you very much indeed. That is where we leave it for this week. Thank you for watching, and thank you also to Dianna Games, Chief Executive of Africa at Work. Do send us your feedback, takingstock@enca.com, or on Twitter. The handle for that is @ENCA, or directly to me @BruceBusiness using the hashtag ENCA Taking Stock. Until next time, bye-bye.